This feels like a natural extension of something that they'd like to do. I have to say, it also seems to have something to do with disillusionment with where the art world is going and the kind of heavy marketization, capitalization of it, and they kind of want out.
I'm Ben Davis, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. Art and psychoanalysis have had a long and intense relationship, and it makes sense that these two fields will be drawn to one another. Critics have long looked to psychoanalysis as offering a sophisticated model of decoding images and fantasies. Artists have made productive use of ideas like the unconscious and the uncanny, and of course, artists are very concerned with the questions of self-expression and desire that are at the core of analysis. One figure who has gained quite a bit of attention in art lately for her ideas on all these things is Jamieson Webster. Webster is an analyst and teacher and among the founders of Pulsion, a new school for psychoanalysis here in New York. She's also the author of essays for places including the New York Times and the New York Review of Books, as well as books of her own, including The Life and Death of Psychoanalysis from 2019 and Disorganization and Sex from 2022. Recently, Webster talked with me about the fresh uptick of interest in psychoanalysis among artists now, the uses and abuses of therapy in art, and her new pamphlet titled The Psychoanalyst and the Artist, where she writes about what analysts can learn from two artists in particular, the sculptor Louise Bourgeois and the painter Carroll Dunham. Jamieson Webster, thank you for joining us on the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
So where are you right now? You're on a lecture tour?
I was just working in London a little bit, and now I'm in Ibiza, where I'm on vacation.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you for taking the time out of your vacation to let me pick your brain.
I'm not at foam parties. I'm actually just in the countryside.
Well, not that there's anything wrong with that. I want to talk to you because you are a celebrated psychoanalyst and philosopher, and you've also worked a lot with artists and curators. You've written catalog essays, and you collaborate quite a lot with the curator Alison Gingeris. So to get us started, what was your path of entry into the art world?
There's a story about it that's a friendship story, and then there's a story about it that's slightly more practical, I guess. The friendship story was a friendship with Alyssa Bennett and Alison Gingeris, and I think the first thing we did was on Bjarne Melgaard together. He redid Carl Appel's psychopathological notebooks. He painted over them, and then we did these essays. If you kind of understand that project, the three of us make a lot of sense for it. I mean, Elizabeth with her, true crime story, the mad, the bad, the sad, and Alison's work with Cobra more generally, and my question of psychopathology, art, surrealism, Freudianism. So it was like a great pairing. And then we went on to do some Dear Ivanka together. That happened.
Right. This is sort of an activist project around the election in 2016, right?
Yeah. And there were a lot of artists involved, and it was just this kind of art world pushback against the conditions. I mean, some felt that it was actually an appeal to Ivanka. I think Alyssa, Allison, and I had a different take, that it was like a performance project of like writing about the situation at that point in time. Not really thinking that Ivanka was anyone to appeal to by any stretch of the imagination. So a lot of the work that I did came from that friendship. On the other hand, I would say, and this is kind of important, that someone who works as a writer can get paid well to write in the art world, even though in comparison to what art sells for, it's very little, even though you give your authority stamp to it. But I sort of love the fact, and I had seen this early on, that the art world, or art in general, had welcomed psychoanalysis before it hit academia.
You mean back in the day?
Back in the day, yeah. I mean, and also philosophy. I mean, you can find like Deleuze translated for different art publications, things like that. So I saw this history, and it was very important to me in a way. I can look back and see the first translations coming in that direction of people who I cared about, especially within the French intellectual scene. And of freedom. So I think that within the art framework, I was able to write the way I wanted to, that the kind of more academic side of psychoanalysis did not allow me. For example, I tried to publish very early on an article in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis, and they told me when I would want to join the world of the wider accepted discourse, they might welcome something from me again.
Wow, that is a real classic kiss off, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, that's exactly getting to where I wanted to start, which is, yes, art has been historically this entry point for psychoanalysis into the wider discourse. There's been a lot of interest in those ideas. I feel like that has waned in the last 10 years for reasons that maybe we'll get into. And then I feel like more recently, there's been a little bit of a revival. The seed for this interview was I was on a panel with the curators of the Whitney Biennial, and as part of their research, they do interviews with artists all over the country. And one of them said artists were returning to ideas of the psyche, psychoanalysis, and the body. And so that just really got me thinking about whether there was a revival of interest, whether there was new interest in ideas of psychoanalysis that had been very important to me coming up. And that's why I reached out to you. Do you see any evidence of that uptick in interest in your work or in the conversations around you?
I do. I don't know whether it's where I'm at in my career trajectory or whether I'm well-timed or who knows what, but in general, there's a greater interest in psychoanalysis. And in the art world in particular, I hear it a lot, and I don't know why it's coming back except for more generally, people are worn out by CBT, DBT, these ways of thinking of
It's cognitive behavioral therapy. It's
dialectical behavioral therapy.
Yeah.
That and psychopharmacology had a hold, I guess, starting in the 80s. So, for example, the fact that I think about 10 years ago, I wrote a long article in the New York Review of Books on the psychopharmacology of everyday life, talking about how psychoanalysis might think of drugs as opposed to psychopharmacologists or cognitive behavioral therapists. It was a miracle that they published that. That was the anti-Freud paper of record, the New York Review of Books, right? So, I mean, that already was a shift. And then the fact that the New York Times has allowed me to publish all of these op-eds also seems remarkable. You know, like Woody Allen had his moment, but we also had The Sopranos, and we have like couples therapy at this moment. So there's something like, I mean, it's very much present.
Well, I guess from my point of view, the ideas of psychoanalysis are really important to my entry into cultural theory. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I saw art as a place where cultural theory was really important. And I really thought it was the last decade has been the decade of social media, all these new tools of self-expression. Mm-hmm. And that really crowded out some of the interest in like more complex theory. Yeah. And I just wonder if it's like there's a lot of fatigue with that. So I also wonder if the end of a moment when a certain kind of self-expression with a certain kind of optimism about it came into focus and then hit its limits. And then people are like going back and looking at like, well, we were able to express ourselves. Now we're not happy. And then that brings you back to therapy, doesn't it?
Yeah, and also brings you back to looking for a more complex way of thinking about yourself, if that had been hijacked to a certain extent, let's say, by these more rational positivistic therapies. And, you know, maybe also there's like a fatigue with social explanations, which are incredibly important, but in a moment in which what's wrong is very obvious and very not obviously feasible. Some questions of what the more irrational forces at work in, I don't know, in the world and in humans is probably a bit consoling.
Right. Well, you are not just a psychoanalyst, but specifically you're interested in the work of Jacques Lacan. It's something you write about a lot. I was looking around for evidence of a psychoanalytic revival, and I see that there was a show at the Pompidou Metz in France, Lacan, the exhibition, When Art Meets Psychoanalysis. And I wondered if you just say a few words about that influence. His influence has waxed and waned. For those who aren't familiar in the tradition, you know, who is Jacques Lacan? Why is he important to you? What do you think is distinctive about his method?
I have to say, I'm very proud of the fact that I'm in the catalog for that show. I'm probably the only American.
Are you?
Yes. And, you know, France is a very, how should I put it, garrisoned world. So I don't know how I slipped in. So I'm like, yes. Lacan was, I guess, a second generation Freudian to an extent. He was analyzed by Lowenstein, he was analyzed by Freud. So it's literally second generation. And he was a kind of maverick who had an incredible capacity to read Freud, but he was very much went against the grain of the establishment. And he was arrogant enough to believe that he had the correct reading or the better reading or the more radical reading, which does actually come from the time that he spent with surrealists. So he was very close to Breton and Dali, and some of his first work was within that vein, actually, as opposed to psychoanalysis proper. So by the time he got to psychoanalytic training, which wasn't until his 50s, he came with all of this great intellectual history, and he just read Freud back into a kind of philosophical, artistic tradition.
Right.
And so for people who don't want a more mental hygiene version of psychoanalysis, like get real, get adapted to the world, Lacan presents a very, very different picture of everyday life as symptomatic, of personality as a defensive construct, as reality as something that only you access by a break in the frame, by ideas of trauma as something that shatters, our kind of imaginary sensibilities that we walk around with, thinking that the world is nice, thinking that we're coherent human beings. He really presents a surrealist Freud, I think. And I think at a certain moment, again, with a fatigue of a certain way of reading Freud, he did something remarkable. He's also very strange insofar as his body of work, what he wrote is very small, but he taught for 28 years. So you have to literally read what is a performance by him every month, transcripts of it, in which, he started with 10 people and ended up thousands.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that because he's always been very interesting to artists. I mean, he was Picasso's therapist and, Dora Maar, one of Picasso's lovers, he worked on her as well. But also, there is an artistic element to what he does. I mean, if you're ungenerous, people would call him an obscurantist. It's very difficult to understand what he's talking about. But I think this is a case where artists might connect to him because it really is like the form is doing a certain kind of work. Like he wants you to work through thoughts. Like the point is you're working through ideas and that you don't really arrive at a clear truth. You arrive at the idea that you have to do a certain amount of work to activate thought.
Mm-hmm. He's against understanding and explanation and more on the side of, let's say, desire, enactment, extreme actions even, because where's your life going to bring you except towards something that you don't understand, as opposed to some like contemplative, rational plan that you want to have for yourself, which is why he also wouldn't write like that, as if he prescribed something or as if he has some trajectory or some project. I mean, I think he started every year teaching not really knowing what he was going to do, but preparing rigorously. I mean, in the same way a performance artist might.
This is what I always took away from it as a critic. Part of the things that I think is interesting about Lacan's method is, this idea of the therapist as a screen, not as people go to the therapist looking for, hey, tell me what's wrong with me. It's really about getting you to work through to try and take charge of your own desires. And I just feel like there's a sort of a similarity when you're talking about art where, people want you to tell them, like, how do you make good art? What's the formula? Well, what is the formula for good art? As soon as you've reduced it to a formula, you've lost the plot, right? That's not the point.
Absolutely. There's a interdisciplinarity to him. I mean, he influenced in the academy at this point, art history, film studies, gender and sexuality studies, feminism. I mean, the reach that he's had across disciplines is remarkable in the same way that Freud has. I really don't think there's another psychoanalytic theorist who's had this kind of impact on multiple disciplines, politics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you have a collection of essays that was published a couple years ago called Disorganization and Sex. And in the introduction, you write, the psychoanalyst is the one who takes on the burden of disorganization and tries at all costs to do something other than make it go away. And I think that's interesting. I don't think this is how most people, particularly not most Americans, think about therapy, which is like you want to get rid of disorder. And I do think that comes from the Lacanian method, the Lacanian view of what it means to be a desiring human person. What do you mean by that?
No, I mean, for sure it comes from Lacan. I think it's addressed against the picture of mental health as mental hygiene. Mental health as correct adaptation to the world, mental health as getting real and having a more realistic idea of what's possible. Although I like realism and pragmatism, don't get me wrong. But I think actually in order to really actually be pragmatic and have a pragmatist way of going about life, you have to get messy. And psychoanalysis is extremely messy. There's a very old-fashioned idea called regression in the service of the ego. Lacan would never say this, mind you. But the idea is that you go to analysis 4 times a week. You're in it more often than not so that you can't get out of it. And what you can't get out of is a deeply regressed, messy state of being in which you can't just package yourself back up and like defense yourself back up and try to get on with life. It lets you not do that. And it's tough then for that reason. I mean, analysis is supposed to be hard. It's supposed to be difficult. You're supposed to make a mess. You're not supposed to make huge life decisions because it's such a fucking mess. For
Right.
like, don't get married, don't move, don't change your job while you're in analysis. I mean, back then they didn't do it for 10 years like we do now, but I really appreciate this. And the kind of American, like cost effective therapy. I mean, this is not what psychoanalysis is, which maybe means it's not for everybody.
Yeah, he's been influential in art, but as a therapy, I mean, we're all about the pursuit of happiness. And to a certain extent, Lacan, the whole idea is that you never arrive at the end of desire. The object of desire are always like stand-ins for something that you'll never arrive at. And you're kind of learning to manage that lack, I guess.
It's loss, it's lack, it's deprivation, it's trauma. I mean, in his model, but there's a lot of room for wild affects and the singularity of desire and the sort of beauty of the pursuit of it and the logic of it. I mean, it runs the gamut. And I think the image that people tend to think of what they want when they go to therapy, it's amazing to get out from under that. When you hear testimonies of patients who've been in Lacanian analysis, there's something, I mean, in psychoanalysis in general, I mean, there's something that you hear that feels so different from what's sold on the marketplace, both what therapy is about and what it achieves. And I find those testimonies incredibly convincing. You think this person's life could only be like this after psychoanalysis, as opposed to it fitting into some, I don't know, consumerist framework of selling you something.
Well, I want to get into some of those wild affects with some of the artists you've written about. Before we do, I did want to ask you about one other thing that's been on my mind about the psychoanalytic revival, because the other clear place I see that in culture right now is in this new interest in Carl Jung, who is the other big psychoanalyst. So you see this in the huge popularity of the kind of self-help, men's guru, pop psychology of Jordan Peterson. This is filtered into pop culture through Joseph Campbell and his book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, which became the basis for Star Wars and Hollywood's obsession with these hero myths and so on. So Lacan has this kind of avant-garde method. This is this method that kind of fits into the Hollywood. Everyone's talking about Jungian archetypes now. What do you make of this? Jung's been very influential in artists. Jackson Pollock was a Jungian, I think, among other things.
Pollock was part of that Sullivanian cult that just got exposed.
Yes, we did a whole podcast on that. But yeah, Lacan is about living with your desire. Jung is really about finding these foundational archetypes and myths. Do you see that as inherently reactionary or a negative thing?
Psychoanalysts are so mean to each other, and there's no one that Freudians, Lacanians, Kleinians, Winnicottians love to beat up than Jung. So I could do this with you. I could do a Jung beat up session and talk about how it's like asexual, spiritualistic, like cosmic energy, vague forces that, you tell a nice story around and you tell whatever story you want, which is the story that works for you, whatever makes you happy, whatever fits with your MO. And then you analyze nothing real. I mean, this is like the way that people want to beat up Jung. I don't know. I mean, there's papers by Jung that are really interesting. I don't think I really know what Jungians do. And so I want to be a little bit cautious, but I have a hard time with the Star Wars version of psychoanalysis, like the light and the dark and the mother and the father and the hero and the sun and the stars and
the masculine and the feminine.
water,
I mean, it's woman is chaos, man is order kind of aspect to that, which I guess some people accuse Lacan of that kind of thinking as well.
But I mean, for me, that just sounds misogynistic. And Lacan would say that the woman as chaos is part of a historical condition of patriarchy in which she can't absorb herself completely into the symbolic patriarchal structures and is caught with all of the drive that's ascribed to her and repudiated and pushed into her. Should one occupy that position of otherness? In which case it's a historical situation. And then you ask about, well, tell me about how this was transmitted to you specifically within your life, within your history. what do you understand about masculinity, femininity, and what the person's symptom speaks to, as opposed to cosmic femininity and ordered masculinity as some supposedly universal symbolism that you can then absorb the way that you want to. My argument with Jung is yes, that it would actually be quite
Right.
uncritical.
Okay. That gets me to where I wanted to go with that.
Tell me where you wanted to go.
I think that takes us nicely to Louise Bourgeois, who you write about in this pamphlet that you put out, The Psychoanalyst and the Artist. I actually wanted to talk to you before I realized that you had actually just put out a short book of writings about art. So in this book, you talk about Louise Bourgeois and the painter Carroll Dunham. Bourgeois is this legendary, she's hard to categorize, surrealist sculptor who died in 2010 at the age of 98. What are some of her works that fired your imagination or brought you to her?
I mean, she and him are such funny, contrasting characters because he doesn't want to say much about himself or even his work. And she has so much to say. So I sort of liked them as contrasting figures. And the thing about Bourgeois is I was working with the Easton Foundation, which is archiving her work and is in her former home in Chelsea. And they have taken all of her diaries, they've digitized them and archived them. And she had a 40-year-long psychoanalysis that she spoke about. She spoke about her suffering. She spoke about her works in relationship to her dreams. She actually makes notes about the reading that she did of psychoanalysis. And then you see the way that psychoanalysis just appears in her kind of diaristic thoughts. She's such an incredible example for psychoanalysis to actually learn from and for the public to understand the way that psychoanalysis can work in the life of an artist.
She thinks a lot about analysis, not a fan of Lacan, as I understand it. She thought he was too brain-centered, not bodily enough, if I understand correctly.
I think she also thought that he was this kind of macho French guy. And she took all the men to task from what I can see. Like if there was any big male thinker, she just wanted to kind of take them down a notch, in line with her feeling like these guys just want to tell you how it is. She also says, I begin where he ends, with sculpture. And it's true because Lacan takes psychoanalysis and he pushes it in the direction of questions about surface and form and different ways of conceiving space. She's 100% right. Lacan ends there, and this is where she begins with her question of psychoanalysis. So there's something very beautiful about the two of them coming together at that point. And she also notes that they both married Jewish people and loved a Jewish science as French Catholics. This did something to their French Catholicism, that it changed it and that it became intrinsic to their life and life project. So he's like a mirror image for her in some ways that she fights with.
Speaking of mirror images, in the pamphlet you say, psychoanalysis has a lot to learn from Louise Bourgeois, who turns some well-worn Freudian ideas. What do you mean? Where do you see that in the work?
She says that the work is an act of repetition, not a work of understanding. The work of art is a work of enactment and not a working through as if you get over something or even get rid of something. She says you get rid of nothing of yourself in analysis. You only confront it and figure out what to do with it. So it's not like a purging of the bad parts of yourself. It's having to accept who you are and repeat it and enact it and even amplify it. It makes you more who you are versus something else. And I mean, that's a brilliant point for even analysts to learn because they seem to have forgotten this very basic idea, if it's a Freudian idea, which I think Bourgeois sees it as. And I think the idea that analysis creates a work of art, the work of art doesn't need to be analyzed and taken apart, is very important to her. And so even when she talks about her life, when she talks about her mother or her father, or the works seem to have this biographical reference, she doesn't believe that the work is deconstructible into those elements. She believes that those elements create the work of art. And that's very important because a lot of artists I know don't want to go into analysis because they don't want to be analyzed, but actually rightly so. Like it's not that you come and we analyze your work and turn it into your family trauma and say like, oh, this is the only reason you're doing this.
Yeah. Well, real danger, I think, for psychoanalytic informed art criticism is that you end up using things as illustrations of a theory, and then you've sort of reduced it, fixed it in a way that kind of takes away some of its artness or some of its living power.
I think she shows you the possibility that that's not actually what psychoanalysis is, and I never thought that it was to begin with, although unfortunately it's ended up in some of these stereotypes.
And so your argument, it does seem very Lacanian to me, as I understand it, rather than arriving at purging a bad story through art, finding happiness through art. She really gives us a mode of art making where you learn to make something of the bad stuff, the stuff that haunts you. You talk about this sculpture, The Hidden Past, which it's like a sort of a head-like object hanging in a closet. And I think you read it as almost like the trauma that is always there with you, that keeps reappearing. And instead of shutting the door on it, you just open the door to it through art.
She has such an incredible, she starts late, which I point out, so did Freud and Lacan. They are working in their late 40s, 50s, but then work their whole life. And there's something very powerful about that kind of later in life longevity, as opposed to the artist who becomes a star at 25 and then has mid-career and then what the fuck. So I love them as these examples who all of this life and this confusion come to a moment in which it's the material that you work and work and work and work and work to the end, not in order to get rid of it, but because it becomes the source of a kind of energy. And she always talked about her energy. From her analysis, gained an incredible amount of energy to do the work. But she always says that she suffered just as much as she always did, but the work kept her sane. So, again, there's this idea that the suffering isn't to be abated, it's to be the condition for working.
And also, I think that the attempt to kind of totally relieve your suffering can be a pathology itself, because you never learn to live with it in a productive way. The other thing I loved about your analysis of her is it's a very powerful but also very dark work, and there's a certain kind of power to it that you talk about in a time when, women have more visibility, more power, and so on, but also there is like new threats to women. The world feels like alive with new kinds of traumas. I thought that was a very good point.
Yeah, her sensibility around women is incredible given the time period in which she was working. She's such a strong feminist thinker. What she does, for example, with the term hysteria, which obviously in the world has a lot of misogynistic connotations, but she understood it in the original Freudian sense of what it means to be in a position in which certain aspects of, let's say, bodily life, questions of being in a position that's other than the norm, which would be white male norm, puts you in a position to receive certain aspects of culture that otherwise can't be received. And so she took the hysteric, which Freud listened to and learned about the unconscious and learned about the body and learned about sexuality and took it all for himself, which he also points out that he took everything he needed to know from the women. What did they get out of it? Unclear. And they got listened to, at least for once. She makes that the heart of her work. And I think, with this idea that women can occupy the center stage, we like to get away from the fact that we're still suffering as women. Women still suffer in a very particular way. We still have the burdens of reproduction. We still have the burdens of childcare. We still have a lot of lack of social support. We still aren't equal in pay or in whatever rising social mobility. And, we rolled back Roe v. Wade. So it's important to speak about this particular suffering in a way that gives it dignity and isn't merely something to just, make right. There's something unwritable about it, at least insofar as the place we're at in history.
Yeah.
So, yay, Louise Bourgeois.
Well, hysteria, a very useful term, a very useful concept. It does have these sexist connotations, and I don't even know if I can use it in writing in some cases, but I don't have a replacement for it. It's an interesting kind of mental loop I'm stuck in around it, to be honest. The other artist you talk about is Carroll Dunham, who is a contemporary painter who makes these very funny, strange, cartoony paintings that are full of sex. I could see why an analyst would be drawn to them. What do you see in Dunham's work?
I really liked Carroll Dunham. I really liked talking to him. I really liked meeting him. He also had a long analysis that he, interestingly and in his way and very characteristic of his work, didn't have a lot to say about it, except for that he clearly liked the repetition and the ritual of it, although he doesn't know what happened. But I had a sense when he talked about it that it exploded his life and also made him work in a similar way to Bourgeois. I mean, she went into analysis and did not work at all. And it was towards the later part of the analysis that she finally found a way to work. And he similarly only started working after his analysis. So it's very beautiful in that way. It's not like they came as successful artists or as artists already. It's the analysis that brought them to their work. And he also describes at the point in time in which he started working, he couldn't stop working. And one of the things that I liked the most about Carroll Dunham was that he refuses to speak about the endless genitals that he draws as anything but lines, forms, shapes, contours. He says, yes, art's always been drawing the body. That's what I do, but I don't really want to talk about it. It's a form. It's something to do. So he won't talk about the sexuality. And so I sort of love that. And I also discovered talking to other artists, I was like, tell me about Carroll Dunham. Like, what's up with this guy? And he is the artist's artist. This is what I found out. I mean, they love him. I think they love him for his tenacity. I mean, for just the fact that he just does that. He draws thousands of pictures of genitals and he won't stop and he won't talk about it. And they sort of love him for this. I talked to Sanya Kantorovsky and he said the painting that he did of the character who uses his fingers as a gun and sticking it in his butthole.
Yep. Famous painting. People should look at it.
He says that is a perfect painting. So I had to go look at this and see it. And he says like the energy of that painting is just absolutely wild.
Yeah, for sure. Honestly, a painting that once you've seen it, you can't get out of your head for all kinds of reasons. So the fact that he doesn't want to talk about the sexual content as sexual content, you don't read it as repression. I think you read it on the other side of repression then.
Yeah. The thing that interested me about him finally was that in the new body of works, there was something about the infinite regress of looking. You look at someone looking at their own body or what seems like their own body as a picture. So you look at someone looking at their genitals, basically.
Yeah, you have two things. You have a little conversation, like almost transcription of a studio visit with him in the book, and then an essay about him. And in the studio visit, he almost seems to be introducing you to this idea of self-modeling, which is the idea that we don't have selves, we have self-models made by our brain. Our idea of ourselves as positioned within the world, as having physical limits that enable our sense of duration and space. We are creating all of this as we go along. And I think these images of people looking at themselves, these images that are somewhere between, as you write, voyeurism and exhibitionism in the book, have something to do with this idea of not having a self, but being constantly like making a model of yourself.
And I mean, he wouldn't say this, but it's a very Freudian idea where I can write the sexuality back in that he kind of obscures in his talking about it. But Freud says that the child is very interested in the genitals. Why are they interested in the genitals? Because there's something in the genitals. It's as if it's the place on our body that evolution hasn't caught up with. They're ugly, they're strange, they're uncanny. We cover them, we feel a little ashamed of them, so then that makes us want to look at them more. And the child excitedly looks at it and wonders what it has to do with themselves. So it's the site of this existential aesthetic quandary. And it almost immediately, in the act of looking at the genitals, reflects onto a question of oneself. And of course, we came out of genitals. We came from the genitals coming together, we came out of someone's genitals. It is this strange place. And I mean, this is very beautiful in his work as an existential moment, not just as a picture of genitals and sex or something, not just as pornography in a way, that he's asking a question about why we look at anything, which has to go back to this like kind of originary looking and questioning. And then, Carroll Dunham, I think in his work, there's a lot about where that energy is there centralized on the genitals, and then it explodes out to the margins of the picture. And he looks at the margins as to like what takes place that's a contingency, and then that creates the next series of work. So I almost love this as the displacement away from the genitals that then becomes the question of what one creates or what one draws or where you draw your energy out of and away from. And so I saw something very beautiful about the question of all creation, all sublimation in his work. He'll never talk about it, but it's there to be read.
And extraordinary thing about the paintings is that they are extremely explicit, and yet the word pornography would not enter my mind at all about them, which is a very interesting effect. The other thing you read in them is, or maybe it's an extension of what you just said, is something about the contemporary drama of narcissism in the pamphlet you write. We are in a bit of a conundrum in the 21st century, revolted by narcissism, having linked corruption and power with the selfishness of the ego, and yet endlessly celebrating the self-made man, all while drowning in a culture of spectacle from which politics cannot dissociate. Something isn't right in the way we see the issue. In this atmosphere, meditation on creation feels invaluable. And there's a kind of, I think, productive narcissism or something. Mm-hmm. Like narcissism is something we can't escape, that we work with productively in his pictures of people looking at themselves. And maybe you can expand on that a little.
Even the self-modeling, the idea that you're walking around trying to model yourself so that you can model the world more accurately. There's something very primal about that in terms of the necessity of narcissism. But in order to explode it, he even has this idea that what's true is only what is at the very edge of that self-modeling. Or if we understood that we were all walking around doing this, and yet somehow we live in a shared reality, how then could we conceive of that shared reality? So I
like a shared reality built out of, ourselves, our self-models, our own narcissistic common experience of creating ourselves.
Yeah. And, to see the millions of people posting about themselves on social media as this kind of desperation to get somewhere else than this self-presentation, to really try to find where self and world meet. But obviously we're struggling very much as a people to...
Well, I think it comes back to the American, well, not American, but capitalist capture of all these desires, that there's a big business in trading in our narcissism and making sure we're trapped in our own little mirrored worlds. And that, it's one of the artistic therapeutic projects to kind of try and get beyond, but we're always being brought back to it just by our material circumstances. I guess in terms of the productive use of narcissism, I guess I wanted to finally come back to art making and art school. A decade ago, maybe more, there's this op-ed in the New York Times that really stuck with me by Steve Almond, where he was talking about how there'd been a decline at that time in talk therapy, but that had coincided with a surge of people going to creative writing programs, getting an MFAs. And I think it's the same with art school. It seemed like at that time, at least, people had displaced a certain thing they wanted from therapy into going into programs where they explored their own creative expression. And they might be like getting some of the same thing, but in a displaced way out of that. Certainly when I've taught, sometimes you realize that you really are doing a form of therapy for the art students, that people are trying to express something, a piece of themselves through art, that's why they're here. And almost get to the starting point of making an artwork, they have to move through that process where you realize, you've expressed whatever you need to express. So that is to say, in your essay on Dunham on page 49, you talk about the double nature of artworks, that they're both self-expression and something that really has to transcend the self because it connects with others. And do you think that this idea of art as therapy or art as self-expression is something to embrace or to transcend, or are we stuck with it?
The psychoanalytic perspective is that what you intend to express is never what you're actually expressing, or what you think you're expressing is not actually what is going on behind the scenes, which is why there's the slip of the tongue or the dream or the whatever, which is things that happen when you're not there. And I think the best artists, or the artists that I love in particular, especially when I get to speak with them for things that I do, their intentions don't matter very much. I mean, it's the process, it's a certain know-how with materials, and then it's as if the artwork appears unbeknownst to them. So the idea of self-expression is complicated in that way. I mean, I think naive or young artists with their romantic conception of what it means to be an artist think that you just express yourself and it all turns out well. And I think that that idea is in tension also with what it is in your non-intention intention, or your capacity to tap into that will then speak to somebody else. What of your unconscious desire do you get to transmit to the world? So for Lacan, this was important because he says sublimation is a miracle such that your unconscious desire, which is absolutely specific to you and unknown to you, can even mean something to someone else, right? And this is the enigma of art, and this is the power of art, that somehow you are able to tap into what is specific, unique, strange, uncanny, unwieldy in another person, and especially in their body of work. And if that takes place, you don't know whether it's possible. You have to keep working on your unconscious life or with your unconscious life, and whether it speaks to someone else, you don't know. So all of the intentionality at that point is out the window. You can go to 100 MFAs, and how are you going to grab that? The best of teachers are able to kind of push you, right, in a certain direction that you don't understand, or point out the mistakes that you're making that are actually more interesting than what you thought that you were doing. But I mean, this is a very difficult project. And it's a project that requires a lot of discomfort, a lot of pain, a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of not really paying attention to the market, as it were, or contemporary politics, or like what's in vogue. I think that there's a huge tension there. And if there's anything that's been exciting for artists to work with me, or even their fantasy of working with me when I write about them, it's that at the very least, maybe I'll hear this. They want to hear it back so bad. What are they up to that they don't understand? So, I mean, the great leeway that I've had as a psychoanalyst coming to write about the arts is that I've found that the artists are so excited about what I potentially do. And that gives me a lot of freedom in a way.
Before I let you go, I did want to just ask you to give me just a little bit on this new school you're a part of here in New York, Pulsion. I know artists who are interested in it, some artists who have signed up, some arts writers who are now training to be therapists. So it seems to have a bit of buzz in this community, and I wanted to ask you about it.
Thank you for asking about it. Freud was a huge champion of lay psychoanalysis. And the strange fact of history is that New York actually has a degree called a license in psychoanalysis for anyone with a master's level degree in anything to retrain as a psychoanalyst. So we have a lot of people from journalism, philosophy, but also the arts and art history coming now to retrain as psychoanalysts, maybe in line with this interest in psychoanalysis that has reemerged. What I hear from them is that it's been an important part of their education. They're thinking about their work, and maybe also the context of working, whether it's working as a curator or as an artist who works with a gallery or who works with collectors. I mean, just the whole kind of collaborative and reading aspect of being an artist or being someone who works with art, and that this feels like a natural extension of something that they'd like to do. I have to say, it also seems to have something to do with disillusionment with where the art world is going and the kind of heavy marketization, capitalization of it. And they kind of want out.
For sure.
And I think they're going to make great psychoanalysts. I think we've needed this for a long time. It's needed to not just be quote unquote mental health professionals.
Well, Jamieson Webster, thank you so much for taking time to talk to me. I could keep talking to you for hours and hours and hours, but you get paid for that.
That's true. That's true. Thank you, Ben. Thank you.
That is it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard here, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, please take a moment to rate and review our show. I hate to beg, but it does help other listeners discover what we're doing. As always, The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili and Caroline Goldstein. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week.